I have a question for Julian. You started with naming a few paradigms of approaching and interpreting the avant-garde from like the 1980s and so on. I would like you to maybe say a few words about the current paradigm of approaching the avant-garde, especially Russian avant-garde in the US, in terms of interpretation and exhibition.
You know, I probably can't answer all that effectively from the perspective of the absolute present. I can look, you know, through the. I would look through the lens of people like Maria Goff, Christina Keir, and also Leah Dickerson and the exhibition Inventing Abstraction. One of the things that I think the most interesting developments that I'm noticing in general about histories of the avant-garde is the beginning of thinking about them not as national histories, but as thinking about the avant-garde in terms of transnational relationships. I understand that there's an exhibition right now thinking about the relationship between Eastern European avant-gardes and Latin American avant-gardes in Warsaw. This is, I think, a signal of the increased importance of imagining the network and transnational communication versus, you know, sort of relegating. Maybe this is a little bit why I'm stumped by the question, because it seems to me that an exhibition like Inventing Abstraction would be specifically devoted to unraveling the sense of the Soviet or the Russian, the national character of that movement. I have one question, and this is a question that came to mind when I was listening to you, Daniel. But Jeremy, maybe you can think about it as well. And it was about the avant-garde's relationship to the horizon of the political. You know, the sort of twinned character of the political vanguard and the aesthetic avant-garde. Certainly. In different ways, the movements of the teens and 20s were explicitly political. The horizon of Dada was explicitly connected to resistance to their sense of the devastation of World War I. Certainly, a pacifist or anarchist position was part of that. Members of the Dada group in Berlin were explicitly Bolshevist. You know, Stravinsky and Kobro themselves had a specific set of politics. I believe, you know, how coherent or practical, maybe you can say. So I'm just curious if you can say a little bit more. You know, the Société Anonyme, I know a little bit about. The horizon for Duchamp, I'm not sure, but the horizon for Dreyer would be something like theosophy and cosmism and stuff like this. You know, which is, if not is parapolitical, but still has some sort of projection of a future social harmony. I don't know.
Should I? Yeah. Go ahead. So. There were, of course, in Poland there were different groups. Sztuka and Żarnower, for example, were straightforward communist and believed strongly in a straightforward application of art for political means. But Stravinsky and Kobro, having seen and been to the Soviet Union and saw the realization of utopia and also instrumentalization of art per se, had a more cautious approach to what does it mean for the art to be politically effective, efficient, or politically active even. So. For Stravinsky, for example, it was more about the slow process of emancipation through consciousness, through development of the new abilities in terms of vision that could be called political or social practice. And that's why the museum was at the center of the practice, not so much as a propaganda tool, but that too, propaganda for new art as a tool of social development, but not in a strictly or straightforward political sense. Hence, I would say that it is for Strzemiński and Kobro, it is much closer to, for example, Lukács for the development of historical consciousness, or, if I may, even to Rancière, than to the straightforward for political ideas of the date.
And I can just say briefly that I think Dreyer is, if she has a sort of extra aesthetic position, it is, as you say, spiritualist. Although, and I think that the Société Anonyme made a very calculated decision not to be political, but Dreyer did flirt a bit with right-wing positions later in the mid-century. The situation with modernist poetry is a little bit more interesting, because I mentioned briefly in my talk that that the colony at Grantwood was associated with figures who had been associated with the Ferrer School, which was set up by the anarchist Emma Goldman, and a number of the writers were anarchists. And I think that that others also, let's say, took a, let's say, had a very calculated relationship to the term radical, right? So in reviews of the verse, sometimes radicalism would refer to political radicalism, and sometimes it would refer to aesthetic radicalism. And I think they were quite canny about how that situated them in the field. But more generally, verse in the teens and early 20s, which was explicitly political, tended to use more traditional verse forms, especially the sonnet. So another magazine, which very famous and quite widely distributed magazine from the teens and 20s, was a magazine called The Masses, and almost all of the poems that appeared in The Masses were in traditional forms like ballads and sonnets. They had some free verse, but certainly all of the editors were also poets, and they all wrote sonnets.
Actually, I have a question to Joanna. That was really interesting what you've been saying about origins myths. And do you think it's a recent thing that we are really going back to? It's also happening here to us, to Muzeum Sztuki. We are going back to the origins myth and using it, the reusing. Do you think it's a recent strategy for institutions, or it has been for a long while?
I was thinking it's maybe a new strategy, but after Daniel's talk, I think we see an ongoing engagement, at least in this institution in the 60s, 70s, and then again in the now, of going back and reassessing or revitalizing. And so I think, I mean, for me, it does feel very new, but I'm sure there are counterexamples.
Do you think that institutions now are more self-conscious? That is this kind of recursive character of institutions, self-thematizing in some way.
Like coming to the present moment through institutional critique or something. Like we've all come through the 70s.
That's what I wanted to say. Yeah. The art is more conscious of its own placement, of its own space of being produced. So naturally, we need to be more conscious of the constraints of the institutions per se.
I would just quickly say, I mean, the exhibition that you discussed in your talk is an excellent example of that. And in the United States, there have been a number of exhibitions over the last 10 years which were reconstructing famous exhibitions, right? And that seems to me to be something that one didn't have 20, 25 years ago.
Right, so the art becomes institutional critique, but then curatorial practice itself can be self-critical.
If I may, there's a very touching and interesting moment to your talk, Joanna and Julian, that is in striking dissonance with the words of Straczynski, where the chance in an exhibition is something that is not that shouldn't be embraced by the institution. And of course, like we're finally maybe at the moment when we can reevaluate chance and those chance encounters as parts of the narrative that is not only teleological, if I may. You know, that there are moments in the institutional life and the longitude and the processes that are not human in nature, but they just happen.
Connecting to what you just said and to my very first visit at the Neoplastic Room yesterday, which was stunning, I have another question, because you were saying that probably during from 1950 to 60, in this room, these 19th century realist painting was hanging, and it makes me think about the politics that made that happen, and also the heritage of the Stalinist realism. That is sort of the backside of all what we are talking about. How is this part of the history sort of taken care of in the context of the pratique of the museum?
To be frank, we don't have a lot of traces of that past. But there are no photographs depicting the Neoplastic Room with the paintings I've mentioned being there. So that even the daughter of Marian Minich claims that the room was not even painted over, but was closed to the publics, which is doubtful. But then you can imagine that it was something that was heavily imposed on Marian Minich, who, mind you, was the director since 1935, with a brief moment of not being around during the Second World War, and had a strong belief in the modernistic practice and abstract art being for the most valued part of the collection. He was the director throughout the 50s. And we know what shows were happening there, but the amount of photographs that were taken is really small in comparison to the things that they said that they were doing. So probably he was also for saving us from the disgrace of seeing those things. If I may psychologize, you know, those moments. If that answers your question slightly, even or approaches.
May I ask if it's known or you have a theory as to why Straczynski chose that room for the Neoplastic Room? Because it seems like there could be other rooms that could have been the final room, but it is the only room which is not rectilinear, I believe.
Yeah. Again, this will be a reconstruction or a claim, because there are no accounts about that. I think that the diagonal, the introduction of the diagonal window, that would repeat the window in the ceiling would be the reason. But then again, diagonal would not be something Mondrianian. But again, mind you that there is a Theo van Doesburg in the room. So if I may follow the lead, you know, that would be meaningful to have this dynamic and diagonal moment in the whole construction.
So your question brings up something. I had a moment when we were looking at the Neoplastic Room last night that I saw something in it that I don't think I saw before, which was its extraordinary vulnerability. And this comes from having seen Straczynski's works, placed recently in Documenta in a key position. I think they were works from the series Cheap as Mud. which were made during the war and which have this extraordinary sense of vulnerability and a life that's coming apart at the seams, the boundaries of bodies unraveling, and an extremely touching and terrifying way. And I think having seen those recently, coming back to this staging after the war, the beneath, somewhere behind the idealism, there is this sense of things crumbling. I felt it so. One of the things that I noticed after we'd made our sequence of images was just the despite the avant-garde's performance of strength and rigor and extremity, especially in the form of the neoplastic work or constructivism or Dada in a different way and blah blah blah, just how vulnerable so many of these people on screen that we put on screen are. The image that we end with of the anti-war museum, which was built by Ernst Friedrich, anarchist and pacifist. This museum was closed a few years later by the Nazi government and used then as an SS station, as a way of turning. It's a very Trumpian maneuver to do so. Dorner himself had protested the degenerate art show. The image that was on screen was of an installation he had planned for the Rhode Island art school, a reinstallation of their classical collection. He was in Rhode Island, a German director in Rhode Island, because he'd protested the degenerate art show and been ousted and had to flee the country. Soon he would himself be, in the weirdest injustice, he would himself be accused of being a Nazi because he was German, and so he would be fired unjustly. Just the extreme sense in which this attempt to claim for kind of harmony and clarity, lives alongside this just shocking vulnerability. I don't know. That's the sense that I had as I was listening and watching.
If I may add something to, and it's not. This is again simultaneous. Strzemiński is at the time is also writing his novel, for which at least the part that we have ends with this. For this body being really a subject to dissection, for really being in a sense biopoliticized and treated as nothing and cheap as mud. But this was a brief moment when he could really take part in rebuilding of a new world. I recently saw some paintings of Tatlin from late 40s, early 50s, and that's a terrifying set of objects. They are realistic. Some of them depict, for example, a pile of meat on the table, for returning, so to say, from the dreams of utopia to the staggering reality of himself being a body set in a cage of sorts. He was probably also alcoholic at the time, but what he could depict is just the objects that are at his disposal, like only within the reach of his hands, and it's one of the worst moments, I think, for the dreams of the avant-garde not being fulfilled.